Ah, yeah, there we go. Muted. Yeah, so I think this is yours, Atsuki, and I'd say I think I will run through them all, and as it's being recorded, what evs. Um, so one of the issues, I think it was you, Atsuki, about framing and composition and like artistic framing from last time. Like if you're having everything explained out to the borders, you're kind of indicating that everything is Tassos. Yeah, nice one. Uh, anyways, it becomes when everything is border to border like this, you really got to make sure that everything is paid attention to, and have a framing that helps the image. And another thing with reflections, for example, it's a hard thing to reflect. Like I would, for example, I would. Let's see. Let's see if it works. The What you got to be careful with is reflecting darkness to somewhere where it doesn't need to be. In when you're looking at reflective surfaces, the highlights are the things that are reflected first, the brighter values. Um, it's very seldom it goes, reflects the darker. If it's if not, unless it's a mirror. Hey, Ixie, um, as a general direction. So I would rather reflect the light first. One second, let me get my sketchbook. Now I don't know. I don't know if it's going to show that well, but what I was doing there on the side of the eye is to kind of mute the light. I doubt you'll see it, but yeah, as I expected, you don't. Uh, but generally, it's like you gotta cap the highlights. Um, like the thing I said in the beginning of like artistic framing, and if you're gonna use the whole paper, you gotta make sure that whatever we see has a the framing is interesting. So by for example, if you're going to render it out to the edge, make sure that the whole volume of the image works. So that you gotta think about, okay, what's the framing, what's the thinking behind the light situation I'm doing, and secondly, you got to work all the values in the image to kind of support that. So you're constructing the image with that in mind, and also when you're doing such a close up, and it's great that you're doing these things, uh, but you got to pay attention to these kind of smaller details. If you look closer to a real eye, um, like that I always say, if you're gonna do something simple, simple is really really hard. And what one other thing I was gonna say, I kind of lost myself in my own train of thought, but uh, cap the amount of highlight, the how high the light goes in your highlights and in your render, and where you want that to go, or where the composition is leading the eye. Tassos, yeah. Your skull. Um, I don't remember. Oh yeah, that now I remember what it's called. I think. Ah, I don't remember what they were called. So I'm just gonna get an example. For example, in this drawing, you see how he's kind of capping the highlights by rendering them away slowly, and limiting the whiteness of the paper to where it really needs. It's very visible. Oh, my nose is itchy. You can see here how he's kind of, I think it's a he, he's working away the highlight, the amount of white, and then because he's already capping the white, and then he starts rendering on top of it, and it creates intensity to the highlight because there's separation of it. I can see that you're already starting doing it, but the problem is that your levels, when you're doing that, it becomes too even, and you gotta be a little bit bolder in how you're pushing down the highlight. And you can do that with graphite, like dust, or you smudge it, and you're just kind of caking away the amount of white in the paper, and then erasing in where it just really needs to be really strong. And the more you render it like that, the more control you'll have over the value range. And also, secondly, this arrow is breaking perspective. You probably would want it pointing more towards the viewer, so it's more intense. But it's a good idea. Cool reflection practice. Next one, this is Wanamir. I'm just going to try to get as many down as possible in my lunch. So the topic is reflective. So obviously, and I wanted to have 2 different materials. It's a cool idea. So I'm just gonna general impression. The reflection, like the reflective material, is good. What I'm missing is a little bit of characteristics of the material at hand. Like for me, in my mind, something like this would have a higher saturation and less pure white in where it reflects the light, because the light travels through the material, right? And if the light comes in this direction and shines on this surface, the light will travel through the object, right? And it has to pass through. And usually when that happens, there's like a gain. Because the material is lets light go through it. Hey, Alex Fowl. Yeah, Atsuki, with the eye, make sure details and subtle things like the lack of reflection in the eye from the eyelid and the eye, whatever the hair is called. Fringe? No. Eyelash. It creates like a cast shadow of non-reflective surface because of the shadow on a wet. It's all a little bit these tiny details. But the closer, because you chose to go so tight, the closer you go, the more you have to detail and have in there that you don't start questioning the drawing. Um, yeah, so what I'm doing is just upping the saturation, upping the sense of density in the material, almost like water. There's always this risk um, of being how to say it binary in how we paint light. Tassos, you can join the 2 week challenge if you go to the Discord underneath. Every next Sunday there's going to be the next 2 week challenge, and then after 2 weeks I'll do paintover. It's about like self improvement more than anything. Yeah, so it's all for Amir. I would focus more on like working the material and not being binary in how he applies like what goes up to highlight and to shadow, because there's always a tendency to just sample towards white. What we as digital artists or artists in general gotta pay attention to is manually paint the gradient so it acts as the material we're trying to simulate in the paint. And if you just go like there's this series of art tutorials for like called PSG from Arne. I think, yeah, Android Arts. This guy, androidarts.com artit.htm. He does like breakdown, like he's way more technical than I am. But here is a great example of light and how to paint it. Like, let's see if I can find it here. Like shadows don't add on top, right? And where here, like you don't blend the colors in the gradients. You have to manually paint in the behavior of the material, because otherwise you just get flat white to black and you get very boring gradient, and it's unrealistic gradient. It doesn't exist in that way because you have to simulate the material, and material behave differently because of the technical underlining reasons, right? Of like translucency, radiosity, all these things, right? So that's what I'm saying with this one is like you got to be careful with your transitions from dark to light, because I can see it's very binary. Like, okay, dark sample black, white sample white. When an object doesn't necessarily need to go to white to have a highlight because of the material. Android art. What I did was I googled PSG paint tutorial. Oh shit. So I googled PSG paint tutorial and it was the top hit. And it's androidarts.com art_tut.htm. I'll paste it. He's very technical artist. He like breaks down everything, and he's smart that way, which I'm not. I'm not schooled in art. Okay, so hey Algani, I'm doing paintovers of the 2 week challenge. Be careful of doing highlights evenly, and like underside of I would put the rim light coming in on the underside of the trees more, and then boost how the light passes through the canopy. Up the saturation at places, bounce light more. You make the material come alive a lot more. Make sure that the rim lights that you're applying are they feel like not cardboard cutout, like hugging every side left facing edge. You gotta have reason to the line to go there. There's a lot of flatness in the color here, so I would probably up the saturation in the Terminator. Terminator being the edge where light turns to shadow, and a lot more bounce light. When there's intense light coming in at the top like that, you can bounce the light around a lot more, and you'll make it feel a lot more bloomed and alive up in the shadows and so on. And you can even suggest it in the translucency of the material. Yeah, so that applies to the rest of the painting. I think the concept is cool. Be careful of repeating these in the same size at the same place too much, and then it becomes pattern rather than characteristics of the end character, or whatever you want to frame it. That's it for Amir. Next one. This is Alganis, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have the names up, but I think this is Algani. So when you're designing stuff like this, feet and so on, when one more time, when you're doing a character, and not misclick in Photoshop, everyone that's painting characters, the one of the biggest reasons are like you gotta plant the character. It's so important to plant a character in space. Just gotta go down a bit. So one way to do it, like Evan Almundsen, for example, does it. Eric, the topic is 2-week challenge on Discord. I'm doing paintovers, and the topic was reflections. So Evan, for example, Almundsen, he draws the character inside a cube and plants the character in perspective deliberately, right? So when the character is standing in perspective, you can if you simplify the character into geometrical shapes, you can draw them in perspective, right? And then boom, you have him standing in a 3D space. The vanishing point is over there. Anyways, right? You get that idea. But what's important in yours then is that you're breaking the perspective in many different places. So because his feet are like that, and generally you calculate the center point of of gravity of the masses, right? And because you have all the feet of the character in a line like this, and then he's leaning forward, it makes the pose really, really broken. So if we draw through the character and just try to reverse engineer what you've been trying to draw, there's a lot of perspective issues. Like what goes where, why is the shield pointing towards us, and all these things. Your construction is off. So the best thing would be to do it again. But when you're doing it again, and before you're starting to render character and so on, like think about the posing of the character. And like Glenn Vilpo is a life drawing teacher. He says some really good things. I keep always referring to Glenn Vilpo, but him and like Hogarth and so on, they make a lot of sense because they always think about the 3D aspect of the volume. And Glenn Vilpo says like draw through the form, right? Like the human is not the silhouette. The human is like the torso with the shoulder system attached on top of the torso, and you should feel like if the thigh goes in front of the hip bone, right? The hip should also continue behind. You should like sense the mass. You should try to sense the direction of the volumes, and not just like draw the silhouette of the shape, but draw the shape going behind the shoulder, going behind the back, underneath the neck, all these things, right? Because it's about construction. Concept Sam, yeah, exactly. And one thing that Glenn Vilpo also discusses when you're doing gesture is when you're doing gesture, this is like an animation principle as well. It's like exaggerate the weight, right? He sits really low down in his seat, right? And he maybe has like that, and he's hunched over. Really exaggerate the pose. Like try to nail the sensation of the character, right? And what Glenn Vilpo then says that when you focus first on capturing the sense, like the motion, if there's like a ninja person like doing some sort of like wah, Bruce Lee stuff, try to nail that feeling of the pose, like the power of the pose, how it goes from head to foot, or if it's a kick, make sure that the motion of the kick feels correct, right? And get the rhythm of the limbs. Like let's say it's like a kick, right? And it's a really high kick, like a reverse heel kick, and like try to nail the momentum of the kick with the hands and so on, right? Like, or maybe it's a push kick forward. But this is a very exaggerated pose. But what Glenn Vilpo says that the more you capture the essence of the pose, and the more like science you then apply to it in order to make it work, the tighter the pose is gonna be. But if you start with the science aspect of anatomy or motion, or not motion but anatomy, and you're gonna just stiffen even further. So what's really important, like when you're hilarious pose, when you're trying to pose your character, try to capture the essence of the pose, and the more realism and function you add to it, it's going to stiffen up a bit. So it's really important that you exaggerate first when you're trying to nail the weight or the pose or the action, and then you'll have a way more dynamic character. So here the pose is definitely off in perspective, and where's the hip versus the torso, the proportions are weird, and you're drawing him inside out, like we are seeing him from multiple different perspectives at once, and it confuses the viewer. Um, and in terms of like idea, yeah, it's a cool knight, but it falls short of uh, the issues with perspective, and also with silhouette. Um, like this chain, you can always like push things into the silhouette to have a stronger sensation of because when they're almost flush to the surface, they become non-existent. They become wallpaper. So when you're doing these decisions of what pokes out into the perspective, um, make sure you take a step back and try to think about what's important to the character, like design elements. Like let's say this chain, right, is important for the silhouette. Maybe these knuckle things, right, but maybe have them poke out in the perspective. And when the fingers are relaxed like that, you're having all this force in the arm, and then there's like a pack of uncooked sausages hanging there. You can take the opportunity to show power or pointing or being ready, or and not just like limp. Hey Larib, how's it going? So I see a lot of correct thinking here. You just gotta force your, like, it's the same with lighting conditions. Like when you light something, you have to force the drawing to be correct, and don't draw what you think is right, draw what is right. It's like we love to fall into things we've learned, and we don't see the fact that we're drawing them wrong because we've always been drawing them that way. But I'm trying to make sense of my statement. Like we fool ourselves because we're thinking in symbols, and we see it like, okay, this is how I see it in my mind, but I can't translate it into the drawing. So you're drawing the symbol of what you want to draw, like a nose, right? We can draw a nose like this, like, oh yeah, that's a nose, but it's not the nose. It's the symbol of a nose. And until you really like break down the volumes of the nose, you shouldn't ever draw the nose. You should draw the collection of shapes that define the nose, right? And as soon as you're drawing in symbols, you're not actually drawing what you want to draw. You're drawing the symbol of it, and each of us have learned the symbols differently. So it's better to depict the actual shapes rather than the symbols, right? Hey Guru, how's it going? Yeah, so that's for you. Time is ticking. Craziness. All right. This was fair, if I believe. Double check. Quickly scroll. Fair. Yeah. Hey, the Mind Waker. How's it going? Right. So. Same goes, like I said to Atsuki, when you have a simple painting, or simple drawing or simple composition or whatever, the pieces that's there you gotta pay a lot of attention to. So for example, the fact that all the smoke is the same size and the same frequency throughout the painting, because you haven't varied the brush size or the rhythm of it, you're creating this object that is flat, like a two-dimensional projection onto a three-dimensional world, and it doesn't become a shape that's inside that world, and it's really, really distracting, and you can't see the forest for all the trees. um, you know so so like I said, when you have very simple things, you got to pay huge attention to what's actually there, and make it work for you. So when you're doing stuff like this, make sure that you have rhythm and some sort of depth cues, and behavior that will help sell the image. And knowing like how smoke grenades, for example, work is a big step in the right direction, because there's like if there's a specific way of doing it, it's a funnel that shoots it out, and then it the pist the what's it called, dissipates, lessens the intensity of the smoke flying out of the can, and then it starts to bulge, or whatever it's called. Yeah, so there's many different ways to depict smoke. So you gotta choose one, but doing it just like a equal frequency noisy brush over the whole smoke, like projected onto a 2D surface, it's not gonna read well. So it's important that you try to figure out how you want to depict it than just noise. Onto the rest, like the snow, it feels you gotta pick how you want to depict the intensity of the snow. Like James Gurney talks a lot about it, about like how reflective properties work and how values work with high intensity like snow settings and so on. And for me, you got to make sure that you separate the light from the shadows. Like I mentioned this last 2-week challenge about, I don't remember who it was, but choose which side of the shadow or light you want to have the dance of the painting. You know, like Jamie Jones when he paints snow, for example. Let's see if I can find something. Like in this one, a lot of the action is in the darker values, while the highlights of the snow just becomes a blanket, like it breaks down everything. And here, a lot of the nuances lies in the lit side, where the dark just becomes the blanket. But then he switches it up so that we're jumping in between the two. And this one isn't snow, but it is about value, right? And the dark parts are just the rhythm. The white is where the information lies. And there's just not one hue in the snow. So when you're doing stuff like this, like you have to take how light acts, and how temperature is in your setting, and how you want to do it, what time of the day, and all these things will help you decide on how you want to depict the behavior of the scene. So for me, the snow falls a bit flat. You need a little bit more careful. You can make like selections, have a little bit more of driving edges and softer edges. Usually, what's a good idea is like think about, like with the gesture of like Glenn Vilppu, I was saying to Algani, is to think about the momentum of the brushstrokes and the volumes you're depicting, and try to make bolder brushstrokes that depict a larger surface for the like angle of the shape and mood and temperature, then just go like halfway, just a little bit of there, a little bit of there. And the more you think about it, the clearer the groups will read, and the clearer the rhythm of your painting will be. and use selections to your advantage, so you can have clean and soft, or hard and soft edges, so you can create a rhythm in the subtleties of the whites in snow. So it's not just all like a binary interpretation of the values. I tend to come back to that a lot, and it's an easy mistake to do when you just go like A to B in a gradient. So here, for example, as well, like I when I was doing the mental chrome practice on one of the warm-ups, when I just painted chrome from my mind, I was talking about the harshness of the value ridge. Algani, usually if you have a like a day scene, the general average rule is lit sides have sharp edges, shadow sides have soft edges. That's the general rule. So you can think about that as you're turning the form. If we like zoom in here on this guy, on this section here. So if we would blur the lit side and make the shadow side harder, we are kind of going against the general behavior. But it could also be how fast a form is turning, right? This edge could be like 90 degrees, boom. But then if that is the case, if it's a hard 90-degree turn, we gotta explain that as well in the following or surrounding settings. So then we need to sharpen that edge back up. So the driving edge that's fully lit becomes hard, and then the surrounding edges that are not the 90-degree turn softer. Then we give reason for that sharp edge. But when we're doing just a blanket treatment to everything in the same way, you're nuking all sorts of scope of interaction. Hey Ohms, how's it going? So that's the general rules. Then of course there's special circumstances and so on. Anyways, going back to this, I would he wrote it's copper, I think. First of all, check what copper is. It's not gray. It's either bronze colored or orange, and much like metal, it's shiny. So with a metal, they have a harder gradient transition. Like they don't go, it doesn't go like 100% white, 100% black, and then a binary gradient between them, like a steady gradient, like a machine, 100%, 90%, 80%, 70. Metal have harder banding. There we go. It's called banding because of the nature of the material. Because it's a shiny thing. So when you're doing something that's very reflective, you gotta pay attention to the material at hand. That's why I asked you guys to incorporate another material in contrast with the shiny material, so that it becomes very clear that you're trying to depict two different types of material behavior. That was the idea behind the challenge, because I see a lot of samey material behavior in a lot of art on the Discord. It's like, oh, I just render everything in equal gradients, and this is leather, this is metal, this is snow, but it's all just 100% to 1% value, just the perfect gradient on everything, and then everything just looks the same. Yet this is blue and this is yellow, and And this is supposed to be water, but this is supposed to be metal, but it's all just painted the same way. I see a lot of that. So that was like the idea behind this 2-week challenge, is to force you to alter how you render materials. So this is for fur. You gotta think about the material more. You know, what it reflects. How would copper act next to snow? Would it reflect the behavior of the snow? Yes, probably, because it's reflective material. It would probably band the reflections because it's copper. Just look at a copper pipe and copper statues and so on. And some of these things, they're not bending correctly in 3D space, and it flattens the head. Also, pay attention to like subforms in a lot of these. It's either like angle or not, even though they're turning towards us in perspective. Yeah, and in a lot of these dead areas, like I said, when you're doing something simple, you gotta make sure that the simplicity comes a long way. That you take care of the simplicity and making the simplicity work really well. I don't know what's behind, so 1 second, I'll just switch the screen off. Okay, so it was safe. So this is a painting I was inspired by from I saw on the internet. And if you look at the intensity here in the sky, it's just flat sky. But the artists have spent time on treating the flat sky so it becomes interesting to look at. And that's the idea you gotta try to implement as well. Like when you're doing a flat sky like this, what's the reason for the flat sky? What kind of emotions or compositional use can you have for that? Oh, it's obviously a calm area, and then we see the spikes of the characters there, and things like that. But like, you gotta really pay attention to the simple elements and make them super strong when you just have a few things. Yeah, exactly. Concept, Sam. They're also in value, they're very close to each other, so this doesn't become a high contrast area, it just becomes variation. This is Tom Cruise. I'll have 15 minutes left. I'm gonna try to make it all work. For me, there's some issues here. There's a lot of perspective issues happening that's a bit confusing. Like, the arm is coming towards us, and this is coming towards us. The branches we're seeing more or less from the side, but it starts from everything. But it starts from behind the character, and it just kind of messes with the depth completely, and it breaks the illusion of depth. Overall, the thing is painted nice. The water surface, James Gurney, for example, if you have the realistic painter, Color and Light Guide to the Realistic Painter, is that what they're called? But he's talking about the idea of reflections, and how reflections work. There's lots of details about it, but on water that's not being lit by direct light, it becomes translucent, so we see what's underneath the surface. And water surface that's being hit by light, it reflects the what's in an angle, but also there's value changes and what's being reflected, and the intensity. It's like for Atsuki's eye. Like, you gotta reflect the lit parts, and the parts of him that's in shadow has to show the underside of the, if he has a shadow coming, like his cast shadow is like that from the light source, kinda. So that part should be translucent water, and then the part that's reflecting him, you can't go darker than the water, generally speaking. You can only reflect the brighter values reflects first, and of course you can reflect darker trees and so on in water, but it becomes different. The murkier the water, the brown, for example, the browner the darks will be, and it won't be as like clear reflection. It will be a lot more murkier, and it will only reflect the brighter colors easier. And so there's a lot of technical aspects of it, and the best way to do that is to observe more. And there's a lot of things to take into consideration in reflections of water. It's a science of itself. And another behavior is like the further away the reflection is from the source, like here versus here, the water has ripples and so on, and it'll mess the reflection up. I mean, unless it's a super clear water, but then you can't have the ripples in the water. Then you have to take the ripples into consideration. So it's a little bit of like a chess, like what moving parts do you have here, and what moves do you gotta do. The light on the creature is a bit flat and rushed. It's hard to understand the volumes. Also, the posing is a little bit unfortunate. We don't see so much character in the face or the behavior, but it's a cool idea. I think he sits in the mid ground as well, which makes it a little bit boring to look at. You always want to try to deliver the thing like a movie shot. Let's see. Let's see if we can find a quick example. This is the first thing that came to mind. Like, let's see if I can find an example. When, like, this shot is clearly about him, right? And he's not in the mid range. He's in the foreground. We see the interaction between all these things, and then the rest is staging. Same for this, right? But the problem is when it's just everything is just depicted in one depth. There's a flatness that occurs. Like here, he's in the mid range, but there's a lot of information here that helps the composition to tell the story. But the issue is when you're telling it all more or less in one plane, and the emphasis is spread equally, that there is no clear rhythm and there's no clear delivery, and you gotta really sell it better. That's 10 more minutes. Slumpen, I think it's a cool idea. The scale is off between them. Here you have done a lot better with like what Atsuki didn't do, is like clamping the value range, but your light is a little bit flat, and the how we read this character versus the stares and the eyes, you're losing a little bit of a sense of delivery. I thought I already had it in Photoshop. I would have lifted the character out, maybe have like a nice cast shadow, help dictate the rhythm of the drawing a little bit more. Maybe some swoosh in the cape, show layers or complexity, low contrast towards the end. Direct the eye, maybe have a cast shadow of that, so we start feeling that they're actually in the scene. Maybe reflect the eye here. Probably I would have not had so high contrast at the top. Probably would have wanted to try to direct the eye more towards the middle. But overall, it's pretty cool. Okay, next. This was, who was this? Malevolent Raven. It's the same for Wanamir and Fur, about the reflectivity and gray color gain. Here you made the sky work really well, and we can see some sort of material behavior here in the gradient. But I think you got to be a little bit bolder and more stronger in your depiction of hues and transitions. I think it's a great start. You just need to have a clearer delivery in what you want to push through in terms of narrative. Like, where's the focus? If it's obviously the topic is reflective, so you want to sell the idea of a wet mountain, which I can see you've done here. But like I said, if it's ice and like I talked about, copper, wet surfaces also have a higher banding on the gradient, so you can't have a smooth transition between the values. You gotta band them, and only then can you get like wet surfaces and reflective surfaces when the transition isn't smooth, when it's clearly separated. Obviously, don't use white there. I was just trying to make a obvious point. I think it's a great start. Cool composition. I think it could work. Like, if the light comes in from the side here, you could, have a nice, like maybe a little cast shadow, and play with the interaction of the things, and in that way help us. Oh shit, I'm erasing it to black. You can start playing with that, and also there's a lot of edges you need to have stronger variety in. Like I said, with the snow, the lit areas have in general the strongest edge, and the shadow area has usually the softest edge. So you can work that to your advantage of manipulating how the eye travels through the painting. So even though this is in the shadow side being hit by that, it could still have a sharper edge because it's in being lit in shadow. So you can mess around with those kind of things as well. I can't name drop anyone in particular, like, oh, check out their edges, but what's his name? Piotr Jablonski. Oh, God damn it. If you want to look at the edge work, this guy is on my hit list for edges. Like, I hate his edge control. It's just too good. Let me try to find one I clearly remember. Yeah, this one, for example. Just look at their difference in edges, and which one is like bearing and which one is releasing, and you can pick out the edges and how he chose to put them in, and then add contrast, value difference, and texture, and just cry. Um, but Piotr Jablonski, if you want to do any sort of study from him, is look at his control of edges. They're ridiculous. Just look at this painting, for example, like the intensity of the edges of the hand versus the edge of the sofa versus the stripes of the sofa, and how the stripes of the sofa varies, and how here on the leg, if these two, the stripe versus leg, would have been equally sharp along, we wouldn't have the intensity of her shorts and the edge of them on her thigh. So it's all like a balancing act. You gotta like a sense the temperature of where should an edge be sharp and where should an edge be. These are a bit older, they're not as refined as he is today. But like look at this one, for example. Like where are the hard edges? It's all about the interaction of these two. And then the, like insanely crisp line that fades at the neck. And then highest intensity of values at the points of interest. Cupcake, you can set it in settings, you can alter the resolution. Ohms, mad props. You're really getting the edge control right. Reflectivity of the horse and translucency is really tricky, but you got it. I would soften some of these kind of machine-made, filter-made patterns. You're stealing some attention with them too much. You got to paint some of them away. If you look at Piotr Jablonski's behavior and how he treats some of that information, just blur some of that away with a brushstroke. That's not important. Maybe the top edge maybe is more important, then the rest can rest, and you can create a rhythm how we're supposed to look around the painting. But when everything is like, look at all these details, when they're not really important, you might want to consider where to push back and where to keep it super crisp. So when, like in Jablonski's paintings, we go, oh, look at that flow, like we're looking. So it's a little bit like you got to take your painting and destroy your babies a little bit. Like, okay, this area, pop, don't need it. What happens if I blur over here? Oh, really, Cupcake? That's weird. Yeah, but Ohms, mad props. You're really grasping the balance now in the focal points versus the other ones. Really cool. Really nice to see. Gila, I think. Massive power up here. I don't think it's you, Gila. And it's not. It's like, oh shit, calling out the wrong person. It is Gila. God damn it, you've improved so much. Amazing to see. I think the reflection here is really nice. We can see the story. It's fantastic. In terms of reflectivity, you just gotta like make big selections and make sharper turns. And like I said, with reflections of water and eyeballs, you really gotta be careful with how you when it's a binary treatment of a material, the material always starts to fall flat. So what I was thinking is now is like, if this is like an emerald or something that has like a ruby feel to it, let all the shadows, like a reflections of a surface, fall into the material of the ruby. Because otherwise, when you're just depicting something correct, like binary representation, without considering the material it being reflected in, you're losing some of that that power of suggestion of material, right? You want to you are the creator of the material, so you gotta hint about. You have to understand the behavior of what you're painting, and not just being a machine that renders like top left corner to the bottom right. You have to go like, okay, here's water, here's this sensation of water, and you as the arbiter of that feeling, you gotta understand what water is, the motion of water. It sounds hippie, but the more you try to like be water when you paint it, the more feeling of that is going to be translated. And a lot of beginners, they make the mistake of trying to perfect the pixels, and they stop thinking about what they're painting. They're just trying to, like, Alms for the longest time just zoomed in and perfectly made everything. Like we could see a little bit of that today. It's about sensing what and understanding what you're painting at the same time. But just this little tweak of hinting of the behavior of that crystal and separating the foreground from the midground or background is imperative. And I think you've done an amazing job so far. The smoke at the bottom is ugly. Don't make smoke like that. That just paint it rather than just selection tool will pass it down. Cheers, Cupcake. Hey, Pro 42, how's it going? No, Gila, it's not meh, it's amazing. And for you to have painted it and looking back at the Unreal Ornament, it's crazy. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to spell it. Really good job, Gila. Um, for me, one of your best ones I've seen. Cool. Uh, this one was from someone new. My lunch is running out. Oh no. Jan, I saw all your studies you did. Really cool. It's the same idea here. Like we can see it on the metal here. And you said you added the cloth to counterbalance the metal. You have to push it further. You have to band the gradient more to push the material more. And also metal, if it's shiny, it reflects in between shapes. So you got to bounce light and have saturations gain on the reflection. Here on this guy, I remember now seeing it, like he's talking about reflection, and in those surfaces the light bounces around, and glossy versus dull, like it eats the reflection or the bounces the reflection, so it becomes higher specularity and so on. And he's talking about it over here, and bounce light and gradients. But my lunch is over. Bye all.